God is more like Dostoevsky than Tolstoy. And he says, hey, in a Tolstoyan novel, you kind of know that Tolstoy is trying to teach you a lesson. He's kind of right there behind the face of his characters. Where in Dostoevsky, you're like, is that his view? Is that his view? I think he's probably trying to say this, but his characters have like this pop to them. They have their own kind of substance.
Hey everyone, I got a brand new guest. Maybe some of you are familiar with him. He's actually, I would say, one of my favorite go-to listens in the world of podcasts. It's Parker Settecase, and maybe some of you also listen to Parker's podcast, Parker's Pensies. Again, it's one of my favorite. Parker, I love this line that you have, like, as you encourage people to support people that are making podcasts, and it's really helpful. It's like, I think you tell people, pick your top 5. If I'm in your top 5 listens, would you consider supporting me? And that was like, oh yeah, I think Parker is in the top 5 listens for me, so I should support him. That's the only way this thing works. So I've been wanting to talk to you for a while, Parker. Maybe we could start off by doing a little bit of a background introduction into just start off by telling my regular listeners who might not be familiar with you a little bit about your podcast, and then like just share with us, it's guys like you are a pretty rare breed that come from the Christian tradition, but are deeply conversant with academic philosophy. And I'm just really interested how you got into that world. So tell us a little bit about the podcast. Tell us about your upbringing, your journey into this world of, kind of being a mediating bridge between the academy and lay people when it comes to the world of philosophy.
Dude, Paul, thanks for having me on, first of all. And you have a way with words. I can tell that you've been studying some theology. The philosophers usually don't have as good a way of with words, unless you're in the continental world, and then no one can understand your words anyways. But so I appreciate that. I do want to give a shout out to you, to your own audience. I know that you're looking for, I think, 200 patrons this year. Is that right?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. So folks, if Paul's in your top 5, go support him right now.
Thanks,
Everything helps, and like I love what this guy's doing. He's doing something very similar to what I'm doing. And if you guys lament the state of our culture, or the state of the conversation even going on in the culture, then you got to support people like us. So
let me fire back on that, because I feel the same way, Parker, and maybe we can just hang on that for a moment, not to just like get people to write us a check, because it's really it's really not about that. I was even just going through your YouTube video, your YouTube list of videos, and I listen primarily on podcast. I don't know what the percentages are of people that do the watch the videos, but I'm seeing some of these, like, you've got some heavy hitters in the world of philosophy that come onto your podcast, and to me it's almost like mind-boggling that some of these videos don't have like 100,000 views. And it doesn't make any sense to me. It's got to be an algorithm thing, because the conversations are so rich. And I just want to encourage all of you. I'm going to piggyback on this. This isn't even about me or Parker, but if you want this kind of stuff, I mean, I look at what you do, Parker, as I'm like back in the classroom again, except I'm not paying for tuition.
Yeah.
And that's the whole way I've even looked at my project was, well, I could go and adjunct, or I could like try to remove some of the barriers that keep people, like, so many people, it just doesn't make practical sense for people to go into debt, tens of thousands of dollars to get a degree in philosophy or theology. But these are the essential questions of life. And I feel like you're doing such a service to people that I want to encourage you. Thanks for encouraging my listeners. But if it's Parker or someone else that you guys listen to, if you want it to keep happening, please consider supporting.
Yeah, totally. We don't want to have to sell athletic greens. I will, but
I'm not. That tastes disgusting.
That's great. Well, okay. So my podcast has to do with what we were just talking about. So I married a beautiful woman who worked at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Actually, she worked in undergrad, Trinity International University. And I found out a month before our wedding that because she'd worked there for 3 or 4 years at that point, her spouse, her future spouse, would be able to get free tuition there.
Oh, what a deal.
Dude, it was great. So I always prided myself. I was arrogant and proud, but I thought I want to be really smart. I want to know theology, philosophy, apologetics, and never go to seminary. I want to be that guy.
Hmm.
And people kept saying, "Hey, you should go to seminary." And I was like, "No, you're just saying that because then you have an excuse for not being educated, you know." But I take away your excuse. I didn't go to seminary, and I know this stuff. So people kept telling me, and I said, "Look, if God wants to pay for it, I'll go. But I'm not taking debt for this." And then I found out God's going to pay for it. So
That's awesome.
yeah, so it was nice because it was actually humbling too, because now people are like, oh, if you know stuff, you should know stuff. I'm like, dang, I should know stuff. Yeah, I should know more. So it was a big switch from like, oh, you know a lot for not being educated to like, hey, you should know everything because you're educated.
Yeah,
So
please
it
tell us
was
everything about
right.
philosophy ever,
Yeah,
Parker.
yeah, yeah. And so that was actually really good for my soul and my intellectual trajectory. But so I ended up getting 2 free degrees, and people are like, you should get an MDiv. I'm like, I don't want an MDiv. I want I have 8 semesters free. And so I took a systematic theology degree and a theological studies degree, but I also took Hebrew and Greek. And so I got all the goods from the MDiv with 2 degrees, and I took like 94 credits from undergrad all the way up to PhD level. So it was amazing. Some semesters were 19 credit hours, but I'm like, this is free. I'm going to take as much as I can. And I ended up working with Kevin Vanhoozer on my master's thesis. And actually, I'm sure you probably know this, but people are not doing master's theses as much anymore.
Mhm.
They're doing smaller papers that maybe you can get published or something. And I was like, look, I don't know if I'm going to come back here for a PhD. I want to get everything I can out of Van Hoos. So I'm going to write you a thesis. And he's like, are you sure? I'm like, yes, I'm sure. You're going to be my guy. And then I roped John Feinberg into it as well. And if anyone's familiar or not with John Feinberg, he wrote his PhD in philosophy dissertation on the problem of evil at University of Chicago. So he's kind of a big deal too.
Yeah.
So yeah, my thesis was defending Van Hoozer's model of God from the problem of evil, and I had 2 giants on my
Oh
board there.
man. Oh man. Okay, so I want to talk about that in a moment, but I also want to ask you a question as someone that spent a lot of I don't know how old you are, Parker, but someone I spent much of my 20s. I was already teaching. I just had an undergrad and I had School of Hard Knocks for
Ah,
ministry.
that's awesome.
So I was teaching in Christian high schools, teaching theology, biblical studies, and I like you, I got to this point, and it was probably after years of being in charismatic circles.
Hmm.
And I was like, I mean, people would have said in those circles, like a prophetic worship leader, which meant we just spend 2 hours. Like it's like jazz
Hmm.
meets psychedelic music meets all of this stuff. That's the best description I can give to people that don't have any experience in that culture. And the thing I came out of that was this like vociferous appetite to know God on all the available channels. So
Hmm.
I felt pretty content going, I don't need to go back to school. I can, I'm self-taught. I love to read. I'm doing this stuff anyways. But I wonder if this was your experience. I found when I finally realized, well, part of it was just I was bumping up against my career ceiling,
Hmm.
where I was going, all right, unless I advance my degree, I'm going to be bumping up against, a ceiling here of what I can do. And people look at my education and you only got an undergrad, and we're like, well, you can only teach this much,
Right.
So I went back primarily for that, still with a tinge of arrogance, like you're saying. It's
Yeah.
like I I will read all of this stuff anyways, and I will write about it anyways. I don't know if this was your experience, but I found it so incredibly helpful to actually have someone on 2 levels. One, people that would vet me
Hmm.
and people that would actually expose me to things that I would never read, watch, or listen to as an autodidact. Right. And so I actually look back on that and go, there was a degree of arrogance that I had, but it wasn't smug. It was just more maybe a blind spot, realizing you can't just allow the algorithm, like the YouTube algorithm or your next Kindle recommendation,
Yeah.
to give you what you should continue to have. You actually need to have people expose you to things that you would never, like I would never have read Latin American liberation theology just on my own. I had no interest in it.
Yeah.
whatsoever. And thankfully, I got exposed to it. So, did you have a similar experience at TED's?
Yeah. So I call it holes in my education. I didn't want to have any holes in my education because, like you said, when you're self-taught, you're guided by your own desires, and that's a good thing. But if you don't have anyone saying you will read this book or you're not going to pass, it's like,
Exactly.
well, why would I want to read this book? I have so many other good books. And so I was really stuck in like the Reformed theology circles, and the online Reformed theology circles is like anyone, even other Reformed folks who don't agree wholeheartedly on this point, they're just like destroying the faith. So I was in that, but I started going in deeper because I just got so sick of pastors. I went to school with pastors at TEDS, so I get to talk smack on them. There's some of them are my very good friends, but I was just so sick of like these trite answers that were like, well, R.C. Sproul said this. I'm like, dude, I don't care, man. I like
Yeah.
Sproul, cool, but I want to read who Sproul's reading. I want to read who these guys are reading and then go back and back and back. And I just hated having any holes in my education, partially because I also work as a campus minister with Athletes in Action.
Mm,
And so I have some phrases that I use, holes in my education, and I don't like getting out over my skis on stuff. I don't want to talk about something that I have no idea about and act like I do, because you get blasted. And it's just the worst. So yes, I had that same experience, and I was really glad to be forced to read stuff because I know me, and partially I want to be exposed to new stuff, but the other part of me is like I only have so much time, and if someone's not assigning it, it's kind of hard to read stuff that I like vehemently disagree with. So yeah, it was great. It expanded my perspective, but even more than that, having at TEDS, it's a evangelical free
mhm.
seminary. It's like our seminary for evangelical free people. And even EV free folks are pretty chill about who they let in. Like,
I'm in an EV free church. I'm on
oh,
staff at one right
awesome.
now.
All right,
Yeah.
man. So you get it.
Yeah.
So I don't think I think I may have had one professor who was even in the free church.
Mhm.
So it was great having like a Lutheran professor. And then people talk smack on Lutherans, and I'm like, dude, no, I know Dr. Louis would eat your lunch on scripture, bro. Like you have no idea what you're talking about. So I couldn't do that anymore. I couldn't just talk, I couldn't talk wildly about different denominations when I have these professors who love the Lord and who know the
Exactly.
Bible a billion times better than me.
Exactly. That was, I get a lot, and you do this, you do such a good job of this too, Parker. I get a lot of people. Someone DM'd me the other day about, did you take a lot of flack for something that you said in your podcast recently? I'm like, no, generally my list, I don't attract these listeners that are really tribalistic. I imagine that you don't with listeners or viewers either. And it's interesting. Like, I think that's one of the benefits and of being in going through a legitimate academic institution like TEDS. I went to Bethel Seminary.
Yeah.
They're both evangelical, and I guess I went in a little bit concerned that it was going to be nothing but, conservative. I mean, theologically, not politically,
Yeah.
conservative evangelical positions. And I kind of wanted to be exposed to some things that challenged me. And I did. And then I
Yeah.
started to realize I got evangelical professors that 10 years ago I would have accused of being like liberals. I'm like, no. And now they're tracing it back to like this church father. And I was like, this was the eye-opening thing too, as well, was I didn't think of myself as tribalistic. I
Yeah.
didn't think of myself, I really didn't. But then I look back and I was like, you might have been, the angry Calvinist guy.
Yeah.
I was going in the angry open theist guy. So
Okay.
I came from the other side of the spectrum. It was
That's
like
awesome.
I had a colleague, shout out to Dustin Thompson over at Southwest Christian, and he was the angry Calvinist, and I was responding to that dialectic with my Greg Boyd books, and
Nice.
and then I came out of that experience similar to what you're saying, having professors that were like, oh yeah, this guy comes from the Baptist tradition, and I always just, as a charismatic Baptist, were like, dude, just go either all the way, either be
Right.
reformed or be
Right.
charismatic. What are you? And that's where I got exposed to Vanhoozer too.
Mm,
I'd never read or even heard of Kevin Vanhoozer. And one of my biggest takeaways from my education experience was how how does this guy get how can we get this guy out and more exposure to the rest of the world? Because I still look at him as I think he's one of the best living theologians today. So what was it like studying with Kevin Vanhoozer? Maybe first, like I've mentioned him before, especially when I get into, theology of culture. I mean, I think
mhm.
that was my biggest takeaway
Yeah.
from Vanhoozer's work was his work, like
Yep.
everyday theology, remythologizing.
Remythologizing. It
Thank
took me
you.
a while to learn that one, so I'm glad to say it. Yeah.
Yeah. So some of Vanhoozer's work on theology and culture was for me the most impactful. So can you talk a little bit about like who is Kevin Vanhoozer?
Yeah.
What did you learn from him? And let's talk a little bit about that process and doing your thesis with him.
Yeah, dude. So I started this podcast because of Kevin Vanhoozer. I had all this time with him, and I signed up for a bunch of his office hours and just bugged the crap out of him all the time. And I actually didn't know that he could see how many times I signed up for office hours. So like I had him, he was super my first reader for my master's thesis. And I was like, yeah, just so you know, I signed up for a couple of your office hours. And he's like, no, you signed up for 11. And I was like, bro, I
You
had
got a
no idea.
restraining
Yeah,
order.
I had no idea you could see that. But he is very busy because he's got like 14 PhD students at a time. And he is too generous with his time. If he's listening to this, like he knows that, but he needs to back it down, I think. He's the preeminent systematic theologian, living systematic theologian. Lots of people think that. I think that, but the fact that you and I have to explain this to people is kind of sad to me, right?
Mhm.
Because people don't know that, and his work's kind of tough. He's really influenced by continental philosophy. Paul Ricoeur. If he's not mentioning Paul Ricoeur, then he's not living. But he also goes in to Donald Davidson and analytic philosophers as well.
What's the
He,
difference between two? Can you give a
yeah,
brief, again, like I was telling you, Parker, I look back and I go, I actually haven't had a lot of philosophers,
sure.
like not true philosophers, but academic philosophers working in the academy on the
Yeah.
podcast. Is there a quick and easy way that you can give layman's distinction between analytic and
Yeah.
continental philosophy?
Yeah, sure. So I'll say that I'm a young millennial. I'm 31. So that means that um I like absurdism. That's just who I am. If you're an older millennial, you're from like the Oregon Trail generation, you're a little bit more
That's
like a
me.
boomer. Yeah, you're a little bit more like professional and like and I'm more like off the cuff. Let's say like a lot. Let's be silly. So let me give the young millennial definition, and then I'll
Perfect.
give a more serious one. But analytics are super boring, and they talk about stuff that doesn't matter, but they'll go in on 17 different propositions on it. And so it'll be like, what does is mean in this sentence, And they'll say like, here's 17 different ways that you can talk about is in this sentence. And it's like, great, but what did we accomplish? And then there's the Continentals who are like, let's talk about being and Geist and soul in the world. And then they'll say like, hey, even things thing. And you're like, what are you what's happening? So the like caricature version is that Continentals talk about really big, important questions in ways that are incomprehensible, and analytics talk about things that don't really matter in excruciating detail. And so
Who's some
that's the kind of
examples of each?
yeah. So Slavoj Žižek is like the most popular continental thinker right now, and he talks a lot about Marxism, and he talks like this,
Yeah.
and
He's always touching his face.
always, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's like I think I don't follow his stuff a lot, but I think there's some pretty funny things, memes about him and stuff. Um, he would be continental. Jordan Peterson is kind of a continental philosopher, which is funny. The people he pulls from are all continentals. Um, who would be so famous analytics is kind of funny because there's not any famous analytics. Like the people that I think are super famous, no one has ever heard of. But Timothy Williamson is like one of the greatest living analytic philosophers right now because of his broad scope. He talks about every different subfield he's an expert in. Michael Humer is another one, and it's like, man, no one's going to know who these people are. Um, Roger Scruton was maybe some people will know him. He kind of stepped on both, which was really
Yeah.
nice. That he's like an ideal philosopher in that sense because he could talk about everything. But then, a lot of people called him racist and stuff too, and then that kind of messed with him. So let me give a little bit more of a serious one. They're called Continentals because they're from the European continent, and they started with started with like consciousness and Husserl, and then they kind of took a weird turn into existentialism, and it just got broad from there. So even like feminist philosophy, a lot of that's going to be continental philosophy.
Mhm.
And the analytic tradition has to do more with like Britain and North America, particularly United States. And they came out of the logical positivists. And so these people were like, hey, look, if you can't satisfy this criteria for meaning, then it doesn't have any meaning. And so these people were really attacking theology and metaphysics. And then they really emphasized logic and rigor. And the two fields of the philosophy kind of split in
Mhm.
half. And there was the analytics and the continentals. And as you focus in more detail at particular philosophers, it's kind of hard to be like, are you analytic? Are you continental?
Yeah.
So then it kind of has to do with method. Do you try to state your case in an argument in a really clear form? Yeah, everyone's going to call you analytic. Or do you use rich, flowery metaphors? Well, then you're going to be a continental. And I like to joke and tease, and I like to be on the inside of jokes about both. But I do want unity. I want people to still write in good ways and use metaphor. But I also want to know what you're saying, and I want to be able to find your argument so that I can argue against
Mhm.
it or affirm it.
Mhm. That's helpful.
Yeah.
That's a great breakdown. So we're again. So we're coming out of talking about Vanhoozer into that.
Yeah.
Where does Vanhoozer fit on that spectrum? And let's talk a little bit more about his work and your
Yeah.
your connection to him.
Yeah, yeah. So Vanhoozer is definitely more continental, and that has to do with his use of metaphors, flowery language, and his writing style. So I learned how to write under him in academic settings, and it was really hard for me to transfer over into philosophy after that. But he will cite sources to make his point. So he'll use one block quote, another block quote, another block quote, and it's hard to say like where's Vanhoozer in this line of thought because there's a bunch of quotes, but he's stringing them all together, and it's like, dang, I was just exposed to 25 different sources in one paragraph. That's
Yeah.
crazy. Um, but then again, like I said, he will use analytic philosophers. He used to be kind of critical of analytic theology, but he's come around since then and uses them as well. So I love this guy. He may be a little tricky to read, but when you do, and when you comprehend what he's saying, like it's really rich. He's got amazing ideas. One of the big frustrations that I have with him is that he will drop an idea on the world and then kind of just bail on it. So he'll write a book about something and then it's on to the next book. And it's like, well, but what you said there, I want to talk about. And he's like, oh, that was like 10 years ago. I'm like, Van Hoos, no, that was. So I decided to take a year and a half and just work on one thing from one of his books, the authorial analogy for the
All
God
right, let's
world
talk about
relation.
that because
Yeah,
that
man.
anytime that comes up with any guests that you have, I'm just like, that lights me up. So
Yeah.
talk about that thesis, talk about that work you were doing with Vanhoozer on this, and maybe even, we can get to some of the guests that you've had on that have either helped you think more deeply about that or challenged your thesis.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd been thinking about this for a while because I found it all over the place in theology. The idea is roughly this, that God is the author of reality. God interacts with the world in an analogous way that an author interacts with their story. And so I thought, yeah, this can help us with free will. This can help us with God and time. This can help us, C.S. Lewis wrote an article, The Seeing Eye, when the Russians went into space and they're like, hey, I see no God up here. And Lewis wrote this article in response saying, like, yeah, because God's not that kind of thing. If you did find God up there, well, I'd be really upset because he's
Yeah.
not this local being. He's more like an author in that he's on every page of the story. But if he didn't write himself into the story, then you're not going to see his name. So you're not going to see, Shakespeare's name in the story.
Mhm.
So I really liked that idea, and I started talking to Vanhoozer about it. And I was like, yeah, I want to write my thesis on God and time. So God is maybe outside of our time, but a lot of people have a hard time understanding, like, how could God be outside of time at all? When would he create? And I thought, well, this is nice. C.S. Lewis wrote himself into the Great Divorce as a character in the story.
Hmm.
And, when he was halfway through, let's say he stopped writing and he went out for a coffee. It wasn't like the people on the inside of the Great Divorce were like, oh, where's the author? Time's frozen. There's two different levels of reality going on.
Hmm.
I thought, yeah, we could make sense of God having intra-Trinitarian time. So God the Father can speak to the Son, who can speak to the Spirit, who can all glorify each other, add
Hmm.
intra within
Hmm.
the Godhead. And then he can create created time in the world. And Vanhoozer is just like, yeah, that sounds cool, but everyone's gonna hit you with the problem of evil. If God authored the story, like, why did he write so much evil in? How come he
Yes.
didn't write a better story? Then I was like, dang it, okay, fine. So he wouldn't let me do anything but the problem of evil. I found out later, partially that's because some of his friends were hitting him on the problem of evil for his authorial analogy. So the analogy is awesome. I find it all over the place. Catholics use it. Dorothy Sayers is a Catholic. She wrote a whole book, The Mind of the Maker, and she uses the authorial analogy. Protestants use it. Anglicans use it. It's all over the place. But a lot of people will use it in a limited scope. They'll say, "Hey, this can help us for this, for God and time, or for God's, not showing up in the world, but still being present and active in it." C.S.
Mhm.
Lewis. And I thought, man, I just think it's a stronger analogy than that. So I had to look up what analogies are, the difference between an analogy and a metaphor, real quick. It's easy. Metaphors are literally false. So if I'm like, Paul, man, you're a handsome guy, you're a fox. Well, you're not literally a fox. It's a metaphor, and there's some metaphorical truth there, but it's literally false.
Mhm.
Whereas an analogy, they are literally true, even though they're not univocally true. So that's what I want to say God is. God is literally an author, but he's not univocally an author. He's not penning the world with
Yes. Yeah.
pen and paper.
Hmm.
But authors are actually like a derivative form of God, the author. God created this world by his word. He spoke it into
Hmm.
being. He breathed out the stars. And then, we see in John 1, the author enters into the story. The word became flesh. And like in a similar way that C.S. Lewis wrote himself into The Great Divorce. And so then we get the incarnation. That's kind of cool. God's the main character of the story. You and I have subplots going on, all this cool stuff. But then why is there evil in the world? And so that was really my main focus. And it depends on the type of authorship on display. So Vanhoozer says God is more like Dostoevsky than Tolstoy. And he says, hey, in a Tolstoyan novel, you kind of know that Tolstoy is trying to teach you a lesson. He's kind of right there behind the face of his characters. Where in Dostoevsky, you're like, is that his view? Is that his view? I think he's probably trying to say this, but his characters have like this pop to them. They have their own kind of substance. And a lot of that is probably because he's pulling that from the public sphere. He's probably
Hmm.
talking with people who are atheists and non-atheists and all these different views and bringing their ideas, he calls them voice ideas because that's Continental. You're like, voice idea? Yeah, sure. I know what that means. You're like, no, no one defines it. But he brings them into the story and they have more, it's like they're a real character. And so Vanhoozer's like, hey, if God is like a Dostoevskian
Hmm.
author, then we can still have free will. We can still have our own ideas and stuff like that. And so I did some hard work in trying to flesh out how we could have free will, and yet God could be sovereign over the story. And he's not morally culpable for the evil acts that I do, just like Tolkien isn't morally culpable for the evil things that Smeagol did in becoming Gollum. You're like, no, you don't go and arrest Tolkien in this reality for what his character did in that reality because for a lot of different reasons, right? But partially because Smeagol had his own reasons for doing that. If Tolkien's a good author, then he's going to give Smeagol his reasons for doing what he wants to do. Otherwise, he's a bad author. We call that Deus ex machina, where the
Hmm.
author just drops in something. And it's like, that was a terrible story. You ruined
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And now you're getting at the question. All right. So to me, when I hear you talk about this, because this resonates with me because it gets at deep problems, questions I've had. I mean, like I wrote a book last year that was on the problem of evil. This has
Yeah.
been the thing. And people ask me, well, how long did it take you to write it? And I'd say my entire life, even
Right.
though it took me, I wrote it over the course of a year or so. Because to me, the question that you're getting at here is dealing with like two conundrums that are perennial for theologians and philosophers, and especially in our secular age, is we're dealing with how do how do we think about God being transcendent and immanent,
Yes.
right? So how do we have, and we have like those, the two poles, right? We have the pole of like deism on one regard, which is like in some sense pure transcendence with no immanent living God. So the God of the biblical narrative is actually participating in the story
Mhm.
somehow. You like in some sense deism is, you take some of the logical, some would argue, some of the logical consequences of classical theism, right? And you go, if we pulled that to its extreme, what we have is, again, you've got the prime mover who is perfectly intelligent, perfectly omniscient, right? So all he needs to do is to author the story, or, I often compare it to setting up a row of dominoes, an extensive plane of dominoes, and God
Yeah.
acts as the prime mover, just pressing that first domino down. And then we have sequence domino, domino, domino falling. And then we lose things like free will, right?
Mhm.
We lose things like, well, all I'm doing is I am responding, I am an effect to a previous cause.
Yeah.
So there's a problem there with evil, free will, like totally like just eradicates the biblical narrative, which to me holds these two things we have to come out of the biblical narrative with: is human moral responsibility
Yeah.
for sin and evil, and we have to hold on to some sense of the sovereignty of God. And by that I mean not necessarily that we have to agree on like blueprint models of God's
Mm.
sovereignty,
Right.
right? Like an RC Sproul, that, RC Sproul, I think, once said that if there's a single maverick universe or maverick molecule in the entire universe, then God is not God.
Mhm.
And then it's like, well, all right, now again, of course, you get back to the problem of evil. If God is
Yeah.
authoring the Holocaust, he's
Right.
actually authoring, the Smeagol's, each
Mhm.
individual Smeagol in the world.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
that's a problem. But then there's also the other problem of like, all right, well, in what way does a God who's beyond being, who's not just a thing in an arena of other things, he's not a super thing, right?
Yeah.
So like, the Russians go up into space, we don't see God. C.S. Lewis is like, yeah, that just because you're totally misunderstanding what God is.
Right.
But the problem on that side is you get such a, and this is maybe some of the critique like a guy like Bill Craig, William Lane Craig has had of David Bentley Hart.
Mm.
David Bentley Hart is like, you're teaching the theistic personalism, William Lane Craig, and William Lane Craig is like, well, I'm trying to tell a story that doesn't make God a purely deistic,
Right.
transcendent prime mover. So how is God in the story? And I do think, some by analogy, the idea of God being like a Dostoevsky, or I was thinking about in one of your interviews, and maybe even came up, you have like in, let's take a Marvel comic book,
Yeah.
right? The Marvel universe, you have this like hierarchy of beings, and then
Mhm.
you have these godlike beings, but then you also have, and I think it's in Marvel, or I can't remember if it's Marvel or DC, where the god is the one above all.
The one above all. That's DC. Whoa. Wait. Actually, I thought that was DC.
Oh
It
man,
might be
someone in the
Marvel.
comment section help us out here.
It's funny because it's like the same person
It's
in
the same,
both.
it's the same
It's
concept.
Jack Kirby in both universes, actually,
Well, and
which is
that's up
funny.
for debate, right? Is
Yeah.
like, is
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
Jack
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Kirby,
That's
you
right.
know,
Yeah.
and can Jack Kirby or Stan Lee, who are authoring the story, also step into the story?
Yeah. The one above all is Marvel, I'm pretty sure. I'm gonna say that. That's my final answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's funny.
Someone remind us the correct answer in the comics, but they both have the equivalent. I forget if they call it something different in one or the other, but there's the same equivalent, is that you actually have something that transcends all, way beyond the Eternals, way beyond
Yeah.
Thanos. You have the very ground of the entire story.
Mhm.
But that also, the one above all, sometimes you have these like theophanies, if you
Yeah.
will,
Yeah.
in the stories, which to me is fascinating. And is that sounds similar to what you're saying, right? That there's a
Yeah.
way in which God is transcendent, like
Hmm.
he's the one above all, and then there's God as Stan Lee in the
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Is that a fair
It, it
comparison?
it is, and I like that a lot. So, man, there's so much good stuff here. So you talked about the transcendence immanence. distinction, and that does come from continental philosophy. So the Continentals, you guys win on that one. That's great. It's really really helpful to think through. But there's also so in more reform circles, they're going to talk about the creator creature distinction.
Yep.
You got to hammer that all the time. Vanhoozer taught me, hey, don't hammer that so much that you don't have a creator creature relation as well, and that's what you're talking about with deism.
Yes.
You know, we don't want to have this distinction so much that we can't make sense of the biblical account where God is also related to us. We're his image bearers, right? So I think the authorial analogy really, really helps with the creator creature distinction and relation, and the transcendence and immanence. God is everywhere present, just like the author is everywhere present, even more present than his characters are in some sense. And yet you don't find him on the pages unless he wrote himself in. The theophanies are awesome because in the Marvel universe, they're helpful. Still a little bit hard to understand because it's still an analogy or metaphor, or it's some kind of cognitive tool. Because trying to grasp like God's being, like the Marvel creators, they didn't create anything ex nihilo or into nothing, right? They had to pull from everything. So it's like, what does that even look like for God to do that? But yes, I would say, in Jesus Christ, we find the ultimate like theophany, that he came in the flesh and he limited himself. And this can help us make sense of how come Christ didn't know the day or time when he's going to come back? Well, he did according to his divine nature, the extra Calvinisticum, for the theology nerds. His divine nature, he still had it, unless you're like super hardcore theosis. But C.S. Lewis still knew what time it was in England while he's writing the story, even though maybe his character inside the story did not know what time it was in England.
See, that's where that's really helpful to me.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful analogy.
I love it. So it does a lot of work, but if it does too much work and makes God the author of evil in like a morally culpable sense, then we got to drop it. Then you shouldn't use this. And so that was my whole goal, of saying, you already kind of broached this. There's two levels of causation. So God is not the domino knocker over, but there's James Anderson, one of my favorite philosopher theologians. He made this distinction in a paper between alpha and beta causation. God exercises alpha causation over the story, but not beta causation, intra-narratival causation, or not always. Sometimes he does, and he writes on the wall, or he, opens up the ground and swallows people up. Sometimes he does that, or he enters in through Christ. But even when he's entering in through Christ, it looks like he's doing more beta causation.
Right. Some of my listeners might know it, or the readers of the book would know it as primary and secondary causation too, right? Primary totally. As in the ground of all things, sustaining all things, holding all things together right now by him, through him, for him, in Christ. Everything's being held together, being willed at this very moment. But that doesn't mean that all of the agents in the arena are being acted upon by God to behave and act in particular ways.
Right, totally. And I got to grab that book, man. I was listening to one of your episodes earlier with Theophry, that one of the Gen Z.
Yeah.
Dudes, I love that guy.
I never can say his YouTube. Hunter is his.
I never say it out loud. Name. I always see it on Instagram. I like that guy. So that was cool. I got to grab that book. But yes, you're right about the different types of causation. I think that this authorial analogy can be used by like a Molinist. I think it can be used by different. So maybe it's like a choose your own adventure book instead of like it's all totally mapped out. That might be Molinism. I think that if you're open theist, you could probably use this as well. Like there's different ways to use it. And I know that because I know different authors have used it in different ways. But I am a Calvinist, and I wanted to find a way. I think a lot of Calvinists go in for like a Tolstoyan view where you're like, no, God caused it to happen. You're like, well, be careful, man, because even the Westminster Divines didn't want to say God's the author of evil. And you're supposed to be this big Westminster guy. Come on, read your own stuff. So we need a way to say God is still sovereign over. I think he can be sovereign over every molecule while you can still have free will. And so it depends on what you mean by free will. If you think it's libertarian free will, you might have to adjust this a little bit. If you think that you can still be free because you're a compatibilist of some stripe, then here's a way that you can do it. And I go in for a particular type of compatibilism, because I was really concerned about Pharaoh. My dad read me the story of Pharaoh when I was 5 years old, and I sat in my closet and I cried a little bit because I was so scared that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. What if he does that to me? My dad, I love my dad. He's great, but he didn't have a super great answer for me. He's like, "Oh, Pharaoh already wanted that." I was like, "Well, no, it." He said God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So Vanhoozer helped me with that, and in the book Remythologizing Theology, he goes in. He says, how does God divinely convince people? How does he divinely determine them? Well, oftentimes he lets them to their own devices. And when he calls someone to himself, he uses persuasion and illumination. So the Holy Spirit illumines us and opens us up to things that we didn't see before.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times he uses other people to persuade us of things because God knows what it would take in order for us to believe in him. And so you still have divine election. Why doesn't he do that with everyone? Well, because he's telling a particular story and I don't know the full story. I'm not outside of the text. I can't see everything that's going on. He can, I can't. So you get to use some skeptical theism type stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, if you have a different theological persuasion, you can tool it to a different view. I think as long as you can make sense of it with scripture, because that's my authority, so I
Right.
think that everyone has to find it there. But
Right.
yeah,
And
man,
that'd be the thing we share in, and that's kind of a shared evangelical
totally.
thrust, is that, you know, it is in some sense like I'm looking for harmony. Ultimately, all truth is God's truth. So I'm looking for
Amen.
harmony between general revelation and special revelation. And I think this is Bart's point, and I think Bart's point sometimes is misunderstood. I'm not a Bartian, but
Sure.
Bart starts with the revelation of Christ. And my reading of Bart is that Bart is making the case we cannot interpret. So we can't do natural theology perfectly and get
Mm,
to Christ. We
yeah.
can't do general revelation perfectly and get to Christ. And someone get like, what are you talking about? And I hear Bart's point. To me, this is Bart's point, is that like you have to have a hermeneutic lens by which you would even interpret the events of the world as being good or evil,
Mm,
right? And without the lens of Christ to interpret the world, you're already starting from some other interpretive lens,
yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and to me that's like that's the point where I do think like part of our evangelical tradition is still affirming that. It's like, to me, it's affirming that none of us are coming from some blank slate
Yeah.
neutral perspective. So by which the way we read the world, like I'm just confessing, it's a confession of faith, that I
Yeah.
I recognize I am coming from this lens and this viewpoint already, by which I'm going and interpreting what's good and evil, right and wrong. It's not from some neutral
Yeah.
blank slate.
Yeah. So I would have the old me would have got so triggered that you brought up Bart, but then I would have been excited that you didn't say Barth because I had guys in seminary that said Barth. But so I came to the same viewpoint through Van Til. And for the Van Tillians, they're like, no, Van Til wrote a whole book against Bart. There's no comparison here. And that's one thing that Van Hooser gets hit for all the time is that he sees them both really closely connected.
Totally.
And so everyone just is like, you're stupid, and just goes in and attacks him. But yeah, it's the same thing. You have an interpretive framework. Some of the other folks, like the phenomenologists, will say, well, then you can't really know reality if you're just looking through rose-colored glasses, jumping from one to the other. But I think the Christian would say, hey, we are seeing reality as it truly is, and we're trying to live along the grain of reality. That's a good theological phrase. There's a grain to reality, and when you look through the interpretive lens of Christ and Scripture and the Christian worldview, you see it for what it truly is, and you start living that way, and you see that it matches up with reality.
Mm.
And so it's not just this postmodern view that everyone's stuck in their own interpretive framework. It's like, well, no, one of them is the objective framework. So come check it out and see if it is or not.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no one's like this blank slate that has no intellectual biases or anything like that. No, we're all situated in different places in the world, in different stories. And I think there is one objective story that does press in on us. Is it this one? Come check it out, man. Come on over. That's why, we're evangelicals in that way.
Another fascinating thing about your thesis to me, Parker, is that to me it leads to, um, tell me if you disagree with this.
Mm,
To me, one implication from it is that one of God's ultimate objectives, and I don't think this is one that we get very well in our culture, which tends to, we are so shaped by greed and
Mm,
greed uses beauty as a means to an end, as a
yeah.
way of grasping at um, getting something from somebody else. I just don't think we understand beauty that well. To me, one of the strengths of your thesis and from others that would agree with this, maybe I was looking at, was it Brian Ballard, Dr. Brian Ballard?
Yeah, yeah, he's the man, dude.
Narrative realism. To me, it points to God's intentions being a very overlooked intention is is God as creator of beauty, and that maybe he's authoring a story that the supreme value might be to author the most beautiful
Yeah,
story of all,
yeah.
to author the most beautiful, to create the most beautiful song of all. And spoiler alert for those, it's been out for a year, but the focus of my book was on primarily giving people for the first, I don't know, 17 chapters, just an overarching history of past positions Christians have had on the
Mm,
problem of evil and suffering. And then I throw in my 2 cents at the end to try to do some sort of synthesis. But I conclude with the sort of creation narrative
mm,
from the Silmarillion. And to me, I find that such a fascinating theodicy.
yeah.
It is to me a theodicy from Tolkien, that what you might have going on here is that God is trying to write, not trying to write, God is creating the most beautiful song. And just like what you might have in classical music or complex jazz music, where you might have notes that feel a little bit like they're outside of the key,
Yeah.
that you have dissonant notes and dissonant chords, that he is such a masterful composer that he's going to weave those back in such a way that in
Mm,
the end, the sum total of the piece of music will be the thing that we would say, this is the most beautiful it could have possibly been.
mm,
Now, there's plenty of valid critiques against that perspective. I don't want to say that some individual person's horrific suffering is just simply, well, you're part of something beautiful. I don't think that provides a lot of immediate consolation
yeah.
to people. So I would never use that necessarily in an individual case, but on the macro sense, to me, I think that helps make sense of why does God create out of nothing anyways?
Mm,
Why bring this to be? Why this particular world among all the possible worlds? And I do think the Molinists are right in some sense, and
mm,
that this is the best of all possible worlds. Like
mm.
this has to be, to me, logically, otherwise you're getting at some other thing that might be related to process theism, where there could be some force acting upon God to create things a particular way. But then when you have that, you're like, no, the thing that's acting upon God is God. Then we're
Yeah,
just
right. I mean, you
like,
worship that thing. Yeah.
yeah, that is the thing that is necessary. And then you have what you were calling God contingent. And to me, God by definition is that which is necessary.
Mm.
So if that's the case, I think we have to have the most beautiful, the best possible story, the best possible piece of music. Do you see it that way too? Do you see that as being one of the implications of this sort of like narrative authorial approach?
Yeah. So I think that I think I want to be careful because I am a philosopher, right? So best possible. So a lot of philosophers think there is no best possible world. That the concept itself is not well formed, or it's
Mhm.
inconsistent, because you could always imagine. Alvin Plantinga says you could always imagine one more hula girl, one more dancing hula girl, one more palm tree. He's such a wholesome man. I don't know why he picked that one, because if you just say that's all you know about Alvin Plantinga, you're like, okay, that guy's kind of weird.
Yeah, right.
But he's just making a joke. You can always imagine one more, or so I step off of the best possible just a little bit, and I say this is a better world than the rest, a better story than the rest of the stories.
Mhm.
Um, I do kind of, if you pressed me, I'd be like, yeah, I think this might be the best possible, because there's some hard things that come with that, because then it seems like maybe God is forced to create the best possible. And you go, well, no, if he's going to create, then he would have to create the best possible. And it's like,
Mhm.
is he still free to choose then? What if he wanted to name me Steve instead? Could he have done that? Well, no, it's really, the best possible story was where Parker is named Parker. And so, um, just for the sake of defending it against philosophers, I always step back from the best possible and I say this is a better story than one where there is no evil. Why? Because of character development. And actually, dude, we're so similar. Like I'm trying to synthesize all the theodicies or defenses. I know some people say theodicies are inappropriate because you're trying to justify God to
Yeah.
man. So a defense is better, but then they end up doing a
I'm just
theodicy
using it
anyways.
as a
Yeah,
categorical
right,
term.
right, right.
Yeah.
Totally, totally. So I'm with you on that. But um, I want to do a catch-all as well. Why is there evil in the world? Well, ultimately, a bunch of reasons. There's character development. If we think of the world as a story,
Hmm.
then the soul building defense comes right in, man. Like
Yes.
I wouldn't be me without the stuff that I had to go through, and you wouldn't
Hmm.
be either. And people know this. If you listen to Joe Rogan, in one hand, he's saying like there can't be a God because there's evil in the world. And the other hand, he's like, I have to strive every day to be who I am, and I love it. I love pushing myself through. Even the bad stuff made me who I am. Like, wait, that's a theodicy, though. You just did, that
Totally.
those go
Yep.
together. So you get that. The greater good defense, God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing the evil that he allows. Why do I think that? Well, because he did it on the cross. He if he could take the worst possible evil, the Son of God being crucified wrongly, and he could bring about the greatest good from that salvation for anyone who trusts in him, then he could do that with a lesser evil, like the evil I experience. So
Mhm.
maybe I've gone through some really evil stuff, or maybe the listener's gone through some really wicked, horrible stuff, but it's not the worst possible thing. And so if God did it with the worst possible to bring about a greater good, then he can do that with you as well. Okay, well, then tell me, what's God doing? Well, now I can go in for skeptical theism. I'm not sure, man. I'm narratively situated, and it might be
Yes.
really inappropriate for me to say, God allow you to be abused for this reason. No, I don't know. I don't know the ripple effects. There's probably a billion reasons. And when we, like you're saying with the music, the discordant notes, when you hear it all in context, you go, wow, that's beautiful. I always go with like a tapestry. If you're looking on the backside and you're looking at 1 square inch, it's all weaved together, all weird. You can't tell what's going on. But you zoom back out, you start to see a pattern, and then you flip it around, and you see this beautiful work of art, and you're like, okay, yes. And so in in that view, I want to make the claim that all of the evil that you've experienced or that you've even perpetrated, some of us have been very wicked. We would see that and say, like, I see how God used this. And I'm not glad that I did it or it was done to me, but I'm glad that God used it. I'm glad that I see what God's done. And Tolkien, I'm sure you know, like he says, there's coming a time when all evil things or bad things are going to come untrue, something like that, come undone. Yeah, when you see it in light of the story, you go, man, like that was amazing. The Lord of the Rings wouldn't have been the Lord of the Rings without the finger getting bit off, without going this long trudge all the way to Mordor. Like beautiful, amazing story, character development, greater good defense. So I like to roll them all into this authorial analogy. Planning as "O Felix culpa," "O happy fault." Why is there sin and evil in the world? Because we get to have incarnation and redemption. Because we get to see Christ for who He is. We wouldn't know God as Redeemer, as long sufferer, as someone who loves His enemies if there were no enemies,
Mhm.
right? And so I don't want to be. I know you talked about this in past episodes. I don't want to be like trite about this. And
Yeah.
if someone's struggling with the existential or emotional problem of evil, I don't want to blast you with this right now. Well, technically, you can't prove. That's not the time to do that. But if we're having
No.
a philosophical conversation about it, for sure, of course, I want to do this. And I don't want to press that distinction too hard either, because I think the philosophical, theological propositions can help you when you're struggling emotionally.
I'm
And I know that for certain because that happens to me all the time. Yeah.
I'm very much attracted to the one facet of the argument for character development in this
Mm,
age. And I am attracted to a side of Origen's argument on this. Not that this is, Origen was working within his Platonic to arguably like Neoplatonic, like there are legends, right, of Origen having the same teacher as Plotinus. I don't know if we actually know that
mm,
definitively or not, but Origen is working within that Platonic, late Platonic to Neoplatonic framework, and so he's trying to make sense of the pre-existent souls, and people get hung up on that. But I do think Origen's argument that this particular age is like a hospital for the soul,
mm,
right? So how do we start, why this comes up, maybe as a kid. One of the questions I had was like, all right, well, if we were made for heaven, why didn't God just make us in heaven?
yeah.
Which is like Well, that's a great
Hmm.
that's a great question. And I think if we take seriously that God made a world where there's always going to be creature creator distinction, he's making a world where um, he desires to be desired, as
Hmm.
we all do in love. That I think there's something to this age being a necessary part of God's total story to bring us to an age to come where we would get to the point where our character and nature would be so transformed. And I'm not like Jungian in this sense. I do think there is evolutionarily, collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it, we learn from previous generations, not
Hmm.
just through our institutions of received wisdom, but actually through what would be the word I'm looking for? Through instinct.
Hmm.
Like we have genetic changes that change our instincts over time. So I am, if you get, there's a great book out there, Survival of the Friendliest.
Huh.
Okay,
Okay.
Survival of the Friendliest. It's written. I can't remember the author's name. A biologist or geneticist, I can't remember, tells the story of Russian geneticists who were doing experiments on friendly foxes, creating friendly foxes, and
Huh.
they continually breeded the foxes that showed from an early age less aggression. And what they actually found after time, after several generations, just everyone's gonna have to pick up the book because my details might not be spot on here. But after I can't remember how many generations, you started to see physical feature changes. So less sharp teeth, fluffier, uh,
Mm.
fluffier ears, shorter tails. They were less aggressive over time. And so what actually was happening through the process of continual successive generations of these foxes continuing to breed was it's actually changing their nature.
Yeah.
And I think God is doing something similar to humanity where the second Adam is Christ, the antelos is Christ. And when we will get to the age to come, human nature will be so transformed. We will be one with Christ. This to me is theosis too, on a collective sense. We will be one with Christ, so much so that I think we can still retain our freedom of will, but our will only be oriented towards the good. So it would be like we go to a buffet and
Mm.
what we're choosing is, do I want to have cookies or ice cream for dessert? I still retain my will, but I'm only willing the good.
Yeah.
And to me, what we experienced, like sin is to go to the buffet and not be like, oh, are ice cream bad or is ice cream bad or are cookies bad, but to go to the buffet and to dump all the food out on the floor. That was actually a perversion of the good. It actually
Uh,
isn't in keeping with the telos. And I think I'm really attracted to this idea from Origin that this age is about, he wouldn't say character development, but I'll say it like that, like
yeah.
the way you're wording it, character development, so that in the age to come, in the New Jerusalem, that we will still retain our will, but we will have nothing left in us that desires the good. Like Parker, I have never once been tempted to punch a baby in the face.
That's good, man. I'm glad.
If you have, it's okay, safe place to confess it,
Yeah.
but
Thanks, man.
it's not in you to do so.
Yeah.
While there's a degree of things that I do still feel in my will that are
Yeah.
not oriented towards the good. Now, if I lived in ancient Sparta, I might be tempted still to throw a deformed baby off of a cliff.
Right.
I don't have that in me now. I think God is doing something in the story with humanity where the end goal is Christ, so that in that age to come, like, and in that age to come, we will have these transformed characters and we
Yeah.
can look back and the story will be beautiful. We'll understand why it went through that process. That might be where I'm at. What do you think about any of that?
So I like that. I wonder. So with the animals thing, I'm looking at my dog over here, Theophilus. He's awesome, but he's got these really long ears,
Yeah,
and some people say like that happened as a genetic trait to signify that like when the dog's ears go down, it's showing submission, and so he's just built.
domestication. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he's just built in. Like, dude, look how submissive I am. My ears are all the way down, and sometimes you'll see like a baby. a dog sniffing a baby and he's really gentle with them. And
Mhm.
people say, well, that's because all the ones that weren't gentle with them, we killed them. Because if you touch my baby, you're out. And so certain things like that. But in that sense, like I like my dog more than I like his ancestors way down the line. And I don't think God's like that. I don't think you're saying that, but I'm
No.
thinking of the listener who's saying like, oh, if God's genetically changing us, then like you and I will be worth more than like our ancestors. And even if a million years, if Christ tarries for a million years down the road, those people will be even better because they'll be like naturally more inclined to be better people. And I don't think you're necessarily saying that. I just want to like address that and be like, hey, I don't think that's what
Well,
we're
I got to
saying.
think about
We're not
that. I
like,
might be saying that though.
okay, okay.
Like, well,
There's some like eugenics kind of stuff there. It's kind of scary, man. Where you're like, I don't know, dude.
no, but I'm saying like I think God is authoring it, and when we do
Yeah.
it in a way like eugenics is because we don't have the perspective, right?
Or because we're putting ourselves in the place of God. Yeah, right. Because
Exactly.
we're not outside the story and
We're
we're saying, hey, we can
self-authoring
do
that.
this. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
fascinating.
instead of following, like I believe like if we continually follow Christ and we raise our children, I mean I feel like I am the inheritor of my parents came to follow Jesus in their 20s, and now as people
Yeah.
do that over successive generations, I think what you have like ideally is you've got people like my grandfather's dad was a raging alcoholic who my great grandmother had to kick out of the family.
Yeah.
And he was raised in abject poverty. Um, and I'm thankful for what my grandfather went through to to establish a new heritage.
Yeah.
But he wasn't as kind as my father.
Yeah.
And my father was still probably working things through there. And I'm
Yeah.
working through things. And ideally, like this isn't about like eugenics and self-authoring. To me, I
Yeah.
see it as like if we actually respond to the spirit properly, if
Yeah.
we don't resist the spirit, that might be the better way of putting it.
Mm.
We don't resist the spirit that he is leading us towards that telos, right? Which is Christ. And I do see I'm not making like a transhumanist argument
Okay.
either. So
Yeah.
that would be important to note. I'm not saying like this is the way the age to come is manifested, that it's just going to be purely evolutionary processes.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is I do think there's something about this character development um, facet of the narrative, that
Yeah.
the age that we're living in has to be this kind of particular age for God to bring us to the age to come.
Mm.
Otherwise, why not just start in the age to come?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. So
Give me
I
your
do this.
pushback too, because I see the
Yeah.
wheels spinning, and it's good. It's good. That's
No,
how
well,
we
so
grow.
I'm more C.S. Lewisian because I'm a philosopher. I have to specify which Lewis I'm talking about because there's C.I. Lewis and there's David Lewis and there's
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis says something to the effect of like good is getting better and evil is getting eviler. And I'm that kind of depending on how I woke up, I'm either a pessimistic amillennialist or an optimistic amillennialist. But I think that as a Christian, I have to agree with what you're saying because the whole world if the whole world followed the dictates of Christ, followed the Bible, I'd have to say that the world would be better. I have to think that um, parents would care more about their kids' health.
Hmm.
And so I think like genetically, the health would increase. I think people's education would increase because teachers would go out of their way to reach the least of these. They'd have more support from the parents. They'd have more support from the administration. Everything would have this upward spiral. If I was a post-millennialist, I might think that, yeah, in a million years, that's actually what's going to happen. And then Christ will come back when all of his enemies are under his footstool. And that
Yeah.
means like them actually becoming Christianized and becoming Christians. But I'm a mostly pessimistic millennialist where I'm like, there's going to be pockets that are just
Hmm.
going up and up and up, and there's going to be other pockets where it's just evil. And sometimes you get a black sheep in the family who's just a psycho, and you're like, bro,
Hmm.
where did you come from? Like,
Totally.
what happened? Um, so I'm with you in that, but I focus more on the individual, where I'm like, why didn't God just create me in the new heavens and the new earth? And it's like, because I wouldn't know the despair that I experienced as a teenager who was just like, God, like, I want to die. I wouldn't know what it's like to worship my girlfriend and make her my God and have her just crush me. I wouldn't know what it's like to be the perpetrator on the other end
That's right.
and just be a complete scumbag and then see that God loves me. And he was, no, you shouldn't love me, man. Like, it's enough that you don't send me to hell. Like, just annihilate me. He's
Mm.
like, no, I'm going to choose to love you. I'm going to make you into my soldier. You're an enemy on the enemy lines. I'm going to grab you. I'm going to change your heart. I'm going to make you
Mhm.
into and your battle now is going to be with love. And it's like, what? So I just would not have that if I didn't go through this time period. And so I do that with the individual level, but I think if you're saying that, like, yeah, dude, if everyone followed Christian standards or everyone was a Christian, the world would be better. You have to say that, right? If you're a Christian, you have to
Yeah,
think
and I want
that.
to be clear. I'm not making a case for like theocracy,
For sure. Yeah. You always got to
Christian
make these.
nationalism. I'm
You
not
always got-
saying I'm
yeah.
not saying a power over if all we were able to do was to get everybody to believe the things we believe, the world would be a better place. What I'm
Yeah.
saying is I can't help but see Christ working in the story
Hmm.
to bring it to its desired end. I have to believe that. I have to hold to the we're heading towards New Jerusalem. Now, I'm not saying it's going like this, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I can't make sense of the cosmic scale of history. I can't make
Yeah.
sense of the six cataclysmic events.
Mm,
I believe it's six that preceded us. But before
mm,
there was ever even a Homo sapien.
yeah.
I think it's not as simple. I'm not
Do you think it
saying
could be going like this though? Like, I mean, there's a
Oh,
battle in
I think it
Revelation,
could
right?
be, I think it's more likely like this, the ebbs and
Okay.
flows, and it might be not to get
But
Hegelian.
trending up though?
Yeah, I think it's
Okay.
trending up. And I think, again, not, it's weird because I find myself frequently bringing up Hegel and confessing that I don't like him at the same
Yeah.
time, which might mean, you know,
Yeah.
but, but what might be happening is, again, like we might have these pockets of thesis bumping into antithesis into new thesis.
Mm,
And the seasons of going through the antithesis, right? So if you're living through World War II and
yeah.
that's the antithesis,
Mm,
right? Coming out of it though, it would have been hard to pick to me, like the golden age of America. Well, for some, I have, not obviously not for everybody.
for sure.
Um, but for many, they might look back and go, hey, 1950s,
Hmm.
post-war America, would you rather live there or rather live here? I go, oh, might rather live there. I don't know. Not everybody would say
Yeah.
that, but I'm
Yeah.
saying like you come out of these pockets, and I do think like the trajectory is heading ultimately towards New Jerusalem. I'm
Mm,
not, and if not, like how what's then I get back to like, well, what's the purpose of this story?
yeah.
Or maybe, I mean, I guess there's some that might say, hey, like it's going to get progressively worse. Like my dispensationalist friends will go, we're
Yeah.
getting progressively worse
Any day
until,
now. Any day now. I'm
and-
popping up out of here. Yeah.
right? Until
Yeah.
Kirk Cameron saves us from the Antichrist,
That's right, man.
you
I
know?
I love them. If you guys are listening, I love you guys. My most of my family. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
but so I don't want to so C.S. Lewis, dude, sorry to keep bringing him up, but I think it's safe to here. He
Okay.
he was like a man out of time because he read so much from the past, and this
Yeah.
dude was not fooled by the modern any kind of modern, well, I'm sure he was some, but he wasn't fooled by as many of the modern tropes and stuff. I'm trying to be like that where I'm like, man, if I put myself in like 1000 AD, I would probably be like, dude, Christ is coming back any time now.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. I thought you were frozen there, but
It did
okay.
freeze for a moment. 1000
Um,
AD, if you're
yeah,
living in 1000 AD.
if I'm living in 1000 AD, I'm like, mount up for the
Yeah.
Crusades because I'm not going to let this nation, I'm not going to let Christ come back and find, you know, Christians being slaughtered in Jerusalem or whatever. You say what you will about the Crusades and the
Yeah.
interpretation of them, but I might do that because I'm thinking it's been 1,000 years. And then after that, 1200, you're like, dude, Christ didn't come back in 1,000. Like, I don't even know if I believe this anymore. And no one would say that back then because they didn't have these concepts. But so if I'm like, dude, it's got to be trending up, and start thinking of myself as the author. I'm not saying you're doing this. I'm saying for
Yeah.
me, the reason I'm always hesitant because I'm like, I don't want to get fooled, man. And whatever, who
No,
cares
I
if
hear
I
you.
am? Who cares if I am? Because then, like, what's the worst case scenario? I was fooled into being like a more optimistic person and being like more,
Exactly.
it's
That's where I
like
get
that.
existentialist about
Right,
this, which
right,
is
right,
like,
right. Yeah,
not to be Sisyphus, but what story would I rather believe if I got to
yeah.
push this rock up the hill?
Yeah, totally. And man, whatever the case, so if you are fooled or if you are wrong about trending up, um, the tapestry is still going to be beautiful and more beautiful and in a way that's unimaginable to you. So then you'll just maybe be a little bit more surprised. Holy
Hmm.
cow, man! I thought it was going to be trending up because that would have to be the good story. You had it trend down for a long time, and then wow, look what you did at the end. Okay, I see it. I see it.
Hmm.
And so I think all of us are in that position because we're situated in this narrative.
So
You know,
do you feel more comfortable? Because you mentioned you think you might see the story heading in a direction where the light gets lighter,
yeah,
dark gets darker.
yeah,
I can totally get on board with that too.
yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not saying that. Um, you know, to me, it's not a matter. I'm going like this, like using up analogy,
Yeah, yeah.
but maybe it's more appropriate to say, um, is can we not expect? So I'm basing this more on the biblical narrative and affirmations of God's character and nature, that for God's story to be good, is he not orienting it towards himself, right? So we have the fall phase, which is the movement away from the good,
Hmm.
right? And so again, this is like Platonic language, but you can see this in Athanasius, like Athanasius on the incarnation. Well, why did Christ come? Is because creation was headed on this trajectory towards non-existence, non-being. You move away from being, you're heading towards non-being, non-existence.
Yeah.
God enters in Christ into the story to rescue humanity away from its trajectory into non-being and non-existence to return it. And again, people will be like, "Hey, you're just saying Plato words now." But I think Plato was onto something. I actually think many of the early church fathers saw much of what Plato was saying in Timaeus as almost like, I mean, this was Justin Martyr's thought, was like God was doing something in Plato akin to what he might have been doing in the Hebrew people.
Yeah,
You know,
Genesis for the pagans, right? Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And there's a really, really fascinating paper out there, and I'm so bad at remembering authors'
Mm.
names. I'm not a name person. Great paper on Paul on Mars Hill, and that I will try when I post this to link it, put the link in the description to that paper. But the author and New Testament scholar uh, builds a pretty convincing case that when Paul was on Mars Hill, like he is making really, really direct engagements with Plato's Timaeus as
Mm.
he's engaging with the scholars of Athens, and actually is having a bit of a rebuttal against the Stoics.
That's awesome.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting. So, anyways, to bring that back into the conversation, I see this as like, isn't the goodness of God drawing all things into himself? And I'm not a universalist, so I'm
Yeah.
not saying that. Um, I wouldn't be upset if that ends up being the case either. But
Sure.
instead of saying up, maybe I'm saying drawing to the good.
Yeah.
Isn't that how the story ends? And if it doesn't end with even like, gosh, John Stott, I believe John Stott said this, you know, I can't imagine, I'm paraphrasing slightly, I can't imagine the scenario that some zealous missionaries believe where the vast majority of the human race is damned.
Mm.
Like, I don't see that. In between that and how God goes about doing it is a mystery to me. But doesn't the story have to end, or the song have to end in the taking those discordant melodies, taking those Smeagol stories, and
Yeah.
doesn't it have to end in the good? Shouldn't we expect the trajectory of the story to be
Yeah.
headed towards the good?
Well, so think about even the climax of Tolkien of the Lord of the Rings, where it's like it looks like this is not trending up. It looks
Great
like
point.
right, and it's
Yep, good point.
the surprise ending that's like, Oh, dude, I see it all. And they're all in one spot. Like this is the movie version, but like they're all in one spot to fall into the crevasse. Like, dude, no way. Okay, I see it. That's
Good
amazing.
point.
And
Yeah.
so, trending up according to who? Like according to us in internarratively, maybe not. But yes,
Hmm.
according to the author, who maybe he's going in for surprise. Because I think we do live in a divine comedy and not a divine tragedy, right? And and I mean the old sense of comedy and maybe the new sense because I am a young millennial and I take everything as a joke because that's how I cope with the world.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That's a good
so
distinction, though. I'm glad you bring those two terms up because
yeah,
I would agree. Like, I think that's the thing you have to agree on is that the story isn't a tragedy, but it is divine comedy.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm very much open to what you're saying. And I think that's a great point. Not all stories, not all comedies in the classic sense of that term. I'm not talking about,
Yeah.
Ferris
Haha.
Bueller's Day Off,
Right, right.
which that might be divine comedy too.
Which
Um,
I hate because I'm a young millennial, right? And you probably love that one. So
uh,
my
yeah,
older brother and me beef on this kind of stuff, even though we're
no,
both millennials. But
no, my ideal movie is Back to the Future. I think that
well, see,
movie's
that's a great movie. Yeah,
yeah, I
that's a
think that
great
movie's
movie. Okay,
flawless.
we can both agree on
There you
that.
go. But
Yeah.
divine comedy in the sense that the story ends not in tragedy. But I think you make a good point that there can be beautiful stories that up into that the penultimate moment, it looks like darkness is winning. So maybe I do need to take that into
So
stronger
I
consideration.
actually think that every good like the best stories do that, and they do it in a way that's not ex machina, where it's like, oh, I couldn't have guessed this. They do it in a way
Yeah.
where you could have guessed it if you were paying attention enough, but no one would have in that situation. But once you see it, you watch it back again, and you're like, yep, there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. Um, The Big Lebowski, I'm not telling people to go watch that, but they do this with like he's got this bad acid trip and he's being chased by guys in red suits with scissors. And if you watch the movie again, earlier in the movie, there's this there's this painting of scissors with a red background, and you see that got into his unconscious, and he
Hmm.
had that in a bad trip later. Those kind of things where you're like, that's so clever. You had all this foresight to put in all these things everywhere, so that I see why I see the connections, but I couldn't have seen it until that aha moment. So, um,
Hmm.
I don't know. People in North Africa, when that was super Christian, when Augustine lived there, might have been like, dude, this is not trending up because now it's all Muslims now, and
Yeah.
they're like, what the
Yeah.
heck, and I'm not saying bad or good, or whatever. I'm saying like they probably were like, yeah, dude, like there's a big failure here. God lost some ground, but I think he's gonna lose a lot of ground in order to have that snap moment. But maybe not. I know my post millennialist friends are like, no, no way, dude, no chance. And I'm super happy to be wrong. Like I think all of us are going to be surprised no matter what, and it's going to be awesome. It's going to be like sick, dude. I can't wait for it.
Hmm.
But I all this has to do with the authorial analogy, and I think it's so helpful to think like I don't know. Physics studies like the furniture of the world. It studies like the props, but all the sciences they miss out on the most important aspect of reality, which is its narratival structure. That we are going somewhere. That all this stuff matters because of the plot, and
Yeah. Or
like
at
yeah,
least that's how we perceive it, right? There's something about us that perceives it that way, which is interesting to me. Like
yeah.
I don't know if there's another species that's a narrative based species, you know?
I think you're right, man, and I think I used to think that like time binding, that like planning for the future and stuff, that may be like something we need to incorporate into our study of the Imago Dei. Like no other animal can time bind and be outside of time in that they
Mhm.
can plan. And so then I had some philosophers tell me like, no, corvids do this and stuff like that. They don't do it to our extent, but yeah, no one else tells stories like us, and stories really matter. And that's why TikTok works, because people on TikTok who get the most play, they tell a story. Hey, so I was with my boyfriend and this was going on. And you're like, dude, what did I just watch? Holy crap. You sucked me in with the story, because we're narratival beings and we live in a great story and we mimic God in creating stories. Tolkien spoke and it was,
Mhm.
he didn't create ex nihilo or into nothing. But in that sense, like he is imaging his creator God who spoke the whole show into being through his word.
Yeah, I'm tracking with you. Sometimes I wonder this gets into like maybe some my existentialist influences,
Mm,
right? Is like, or maybe thinking about Kant or others, is like interpretation of story
mm.
too. Like,
Yes, yes.
is there a story that we are actually perceiving, or are we taking, some might say we were just taking bits of data. It's random, it's chaotic,
Mm,
and we are shaping it into a story that makes sense. Now, I think that's probably more of the naturalist perspective, right?
yeah,
Is that we just have random data and we're forming it into stories, and that probably has some evolutionary purpose in, avoiding things that might end our lives,
yeah,
helping us stay alive. We can tell these stories. We can make predictions about the future. We have to be able to do this at a high level. Prefrontal cortex does this better than any other animal. Animals do some level of like future predicting, right? Where they know, oh, I see a snake in the grass. If it bites me, I'm going to die. I'm going to do avoidance,
right.
you know? So maybe that's all that it is. But I think it's interesting to me that I think there might be something to that Imago Dei,
Yeah.
and like, gosh, all the true Hebrew scholars are out there are gonna be like, stop talking about him. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm just so fascinated because I was thinking, this dawned on me maybe last summer. I went to a museum, science museum, and I was just fascinated. The exhibit they had was leading you through like each of the successive extinction events
Mm,
that happen on the planet. In the end, it was like, an argument for, are we living through, this age in which we are bringing about the next extinction
yeah.
level, event through by human mismanagement. But I was thinking about how this story, like a story about dinosaurs, doesn't happen without human authors,
Mm,
which is like, it makes me think a little bit. I'm just thinking out loud with you on this,
yeah.
Parker.
Yeah. Yeah. This is awesome.
It makes me think about Israel's vocational call, which is in some sense to be narrators of the true story,
Mm,
to be
yeah.
light to the nations. And I think that's an interesting thing about our calling. It appears to me the uniqueness of, by whatever means it came about, I see it as God doing it. But, maybe it started off as just like, hey, we need to avoid snakes. So we come up with these ways of imagining a snake being in the grass and how we'd respond to it. And that expands out to our ability to tell a story about dinosaurs that went extinct 65 million years ago.
Yeah.
And we're like, this story maybe doesn't get preserved or told without the human capacity to be attracted to narrative and story. So this is where I get back to maybe I'm Sisyphus pushing this boulder up the hill, and it's like, well, what would I rather believe? And I think I just would rather believe, maybe I'm right or wrong, but I don't
Yeah.
know how I'd figure out whether I'm right or wrong on this. I'd rather believe that God has called us to be storytellers, and that there is
Yeah.
something about that in us, that he's doing something in a narrative form, or at least we're attracted to that narrative form. And there's something about our calling to tell that story too. So
Oh,
I was
well,
just,
dude, this is so good. And so like I even when you gave the naturalistic gloss where you're like, we just have all these data points and then we're gonna come up with a theory around it. You can't avoid the story because even in
yeah,
telling that story, you're telling a story where you're like,
exactly.
this is who we are, and you have a creation narrative. It's everything from nothing. You have you have an eschatology where it's
Hmm.
the heat death of the universe, right? Like you
Yeah,
have a
C.S. Lewis made this argument. This is
yeah,
like, you could, if you turn that into myth, if you turn naturalism into a myth,
yeah.
it's like this really compelling tragedy.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And he does that a lot of places where one of them's like the death of a great myth or something like that.
Hmm.
But yeah. So there's that. I wrote down a bunch here. Oh, okay, dude. So the postmodernists are right about a lot of stuff and not everything. Christians love to just bash on them, especially Christian apologists, but they were right about the role of narrative. They were right
Hmm.
about the role of the individual narrative. They were just wrong about the role of the meta narrative.
Yeah.
They thought, initially they were arguing against communism, and then it got turned on Christianity in every meta narrative. But the emphasis on stories and individual stories is awesome. Like we all have this story, and it's like, why does my life have a narrative plot? What the heck? Why should my life have that? Is it just wishful thinking? Is it just no? They're like, look at people's lives, ask them their story. Maybe they're just doing it because we think narratively. Well, why do we think that way? Why? Oh, because it helps us survive. Okay, so you're doing it right now. You're
Yeah.
telling this story. We can't escape from the narrative. And so what really matters is not the worldview, it's the worldview in motion. It's the narrative. It's the meta narrative going on. It's how that worldview plays out through history, where it's going. So like I think Christians have different worldviews. I don't know if there is a Christian worldview because if you're a classical theist, you're going to have a different view of God than a neoclassical theist. So you don't really have the same worldview. If you think God is inside of time, you have a different worldview than if you think God's outside of time. And yet you can still all believe the Christian meta narrative: creation, fall, redemption, consummation. So yeah, dude, I'm with you. I think stories just run real, real deep. And the more, even when I find myself procrastinating, what am I doing? I'll watch Netflix or HBO Max or wherever
Yeah.
because I'm sucked into some kind of story. And right
Mhm.
now it's Tron, dude. I can't stop watching Tron. I've watched it like 11 times in the last month.
The
Okay,
original or
both. I watched the original because I wanted to
yeah.
understand that other one more, but
Yeah.
Legacy is my jam. But I'm a story guy, man. I'm just kind of embrace it. Like we're
Mhm.
made by a storytelling God who cares about the story of things. Yes, he cares about the other stuff too, but he's telling a story. Why did he create it all? To tell a story. It's insane. It's wild.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. My friend Father Kenneth Tanner, shout out to Kenneth if he's listening. He likes to say that the Christian calling is to tell the true story of the world.
Mm,
And I like that a lot.
yeah.
I think there's a lot of strength in what you're saying. And I'd love to, this may be a good place to land the plane, but if you have an opinion, you've been listening to Parker and I, especially as we're wrestling with, all right, what's the trajectory of this story
Mm,
right now? I'm gonna post this on YouTube as well. And Parker, you're free to, if you'd like to do it on yours as well, or in the comment section on YouTube, or message either one of us on Patreon, or I don't know, you get on Twitter a little bit,
yeah, here and
you
there.
know.
I'm not good at it, but
Yeah,
yeah, I'm
well,
on there.
reach out to us and tell us what your perspective is on what's the current trajectory of the story. Is it going to end? Do you see it as maybe kind of what I was arguing for, which is kind of peaks and valleys, thesis and antithesis, and moving into a new synthesis that leads to the end? Or maybe Parker's right. Maybe it's more Tolkien-like. Maybe it doesn't look good until till the very end. I'm very much fascinated in that. None of us can say for sure. So
Mhm.
it's fun to speculate, and I
Yeah.
think we learn something in even just speculating together. And Parker, thank you for the time. This is a blast. We need to do this more regularly.
Definitely, man. Definitely. I got to get you on mine. I got to get that book and read it, man. Thanks for that. I'm really excited to jump into your stuff because I love thinking about evil as crazy as that sounds. I think
Yeah,
it's important to think about God. It helps us, yeah, it helps us think about God more rightly. So, dude, thanks for your time. Thanks for having me on, and I'm excited to do this more. I think we could do this a bunch and
I would love
talk for
to.
hours. Yeah.
I would love to. Everyone go check out. I'll put a link in the below to Parker's Pensies. Again, one of my top five. I support Parker on Patreon. If you like his stuff, support it too. I think what he's doing is it's like what a philosophy professor is doing in undergrad or even graduate level stuff. It's amazing. He's got some of the top minds. I'm looking at this list on my other screen right now. I'm scrolling through his videos of some of these people that are on there. I'm like, dude, this turn off whatever everyone else is watching on YouTube. I don't know how some of this stuff is getting a million views, and go watch Parker stuff or listen to it. I'll provide links below. Thanks again, Parker.
Thanks, man. Yeah. God bless.